Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Sass. I'm an environmental sociologist, a professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and the creator of this website. This video offers an overview or a general introduction to the sociological study of climate change. The first point I need to make is that the sociology of climate change has three different parts. It consists of three distinct kinds of inquiry. In my teaching, I sometimes find it helpful to use simple visualizations. So here are those three inquiries presented visually. The first inquiry: what is it about our society that causes or drives climate change? Yes, in the most direct physical sense, climate change is caused by the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But a sociologist goes further and asks, what is it about our society that can explain why it has been emitting such massive amounts of greenhouse gases? This is the second inquiry. What impacts is climate change having and is predicted to have on society? And third, how has society been responding to this threat? In this video and on my website, I break down those three inquiries into 25 smaller topics. It would take way too long to talk at length here about every one of these topics. I can devote only a minute or two to each one. So you should think of this video as no more than an outline, a framework, an introduction. Later, if you are interested, you can find more information on any of these topics on this page of my website. Okay then, let's get started. The first of our three inquiries is about social causes. Under this heading, we have two topics: what we might call a green updating of classical theory, and second, causal explanations offered by colleagues in the field of environmental sociology. Starting with this one, the first generation of sociological theorists, thinkers such as Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber, were seeing a dramatic transition in Europe from an earlier type of society, feudalism, to the contemporary type, urban industrial capitalism. Although there are huge differences among their theoretical systems, each, in his own way, made the same fundamental point: that this new society they saw being born was qualitatively different, a radical departure from all earlier societies. Those earlier societies changed over time, but they did so slowly. This new society was incredibly dynamic, committed to growth, especially economic growth. These theorists' insights about the uniqueness of modernity hold up pretty well when one looks at what has happened since they lived and wrote. Consider, for example, this graph. It shows the total of the world's economic activity measured by GDP, gross domestic product. Look at the difference before and after, say, 1750. Although these theorists' analyses of modernity were quite profound, from our point of view, from the point of view of wanting to understand climate change, there was one big problem with their conceptions. The problem was that they were all more concerned with modern society's impacts on people than on its impacts on the environment. It's not hard to understand why. The human costs of early urban industrial society were painfully obvious. Certainly, even then, it was easy to see things that today we would think of as environmental impacts. Factories polluting the air, factories dumping toxic waste into the nearest body of water, slum urbanization, and dangerous working conditions. For us, today, after more than a century of unregulated or poorly regulated industrial activity, it is much easier to see that we need to add environmental impacts to the classical theorists' critiques of modernity. In other words, we need to green classical theory and see how those ideas, now modified, can begin to explain how the growth dynamic of modern society drives climate change. To do that, we can start where they started, with modern society's explosive, unprecedented economic growth. Connect that to growth in global energy consumption, noting especially how much of that growth has been in the use of coal, oil, and natural gas. Then see the obvious link between the burning of fossil fuel and the increase in emissions of CO2, the most abundant greenhouse gas. And then, finally, with help from climate scientists, link the rise of greenhouse gas emissions to increases in global temperatures. So, yes, efforts to green classical theory, explaining environmental impacts by starting from a sociological theory of the unique features of modern society, can contribute to our understanding of the social drivers of climate change. Turning next to causal explanations found in the writings of today's environmental sociologists, I will observe first that some of that literature overlaps with the greening of classical theory, especially with Marx's analysis of the logic of capitalism. But environmental sociologists also cite other causes, in addition to economic drivers, things such as population growth, a culture driven to consume, the invention of new technologies which have larger carbon footprints. One prominent effort to put all this together is known as the IPAT formula. Environmental impact, the I, caused by some combination of factors, P, population, or the number of people in a society, A, for affluence, or the level of per capita consumption in a society, and T for technology, or the amount of pollution, in our case, the amount of carbon emitted per unit of consumption. A good summary of how today's environmental sociologists theorize about the social causes of climate change can be found in this chapter of this book, Climate Change and Society, co-authored by 39 members of the Environmental Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. Let's turn now to the second kind of inquiry. What impacts will climate change have on societies? As you can see, there are 10 topics under this heading. I will start with this one, topic number 3, extreme weather events. Climate change is already causing more intense and more frequent extreme weather events. Heat waves, drought in some places, stronger storms with torrential rains and flooding in others. Let's consider a couple of examples. First, the combined impacts of heat and drought. Second, stronger hurricanes. In recent years, parts of the United States have already been seeing more intense heat waves and also more persistent drought. Wildfires, driven by a combination of drought and heat, have gotten larger, more intense, and more devastating. Here's a wildfire burning in the hills of Los Angeles in 2018. And here's one in Ventura, California, just north of LA, also in 2018. Climate change will make parts of the American South, the West, and Southwest even hotter. This map shows how many days a year the temperature will go higher than 100 degrees. And parts of the United States will become much drier as well. Climate change is making the oceans warmer. Warm water is the engine that drives hurricanes, The warmer the ocean, the more powerful the hurricane. This was the Jersey Shore after Hurricane Sandy hit the New York City region in 2012. And this was the city of Houston after Hurricane Harvey struck in 2017. Extreme weather destroys communities. It destroys people's lives. It disrupts the affected area's economic activities, and afterwards, it is immensely costly to recover and to rebuild. The next two impacts have to do with the most basic physiological needs of the human organism, food and water. First, food, topic number 4. Hunger is already a serious issue in today's world. Official estimates say that about 800 million people worldwide do not have enough food to eat. That's about 10% of the world's population. Climate change will adversely affect both agriculture and fishing. When temperatures rise and when the amount and timing of rainfall changes, agricultural yields can suffer. The world's fisheries will be affected as the ocean's waters get warmer and more acidic. Ocean catch accounts for a significant fraction of the protein people consume. As this map shows, climate change will increase food insecurity, that is, increase hunger. In China, India, and the rest of South Asia, most of Africa, and some of South and Central America. These places are home to billions of people, more than half of humankind, and some of the poorest places on earth. When people are hungry, there is unrest, there is protest, and such protests can easily turn violent. Before moving on, consider all the consequences of mass hunger. Consequences for a people's health and sense of well-being, for a nation's economic vitality, for the legitimacy of a nation's political system, for the likelihood of civil conflict, and as a driver for mass outmigration. Our fifth topic is climate change's impacts on access to water. Today, somewhere between 1 billion and 2 billion people already do not have access to sufficient amounts of clean water. As this map shows, climate change is predicted to have the greatest impacts on water scarcity in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. I turn next to climate impacts on health and illness, topic number 6. This chart, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, shows all the ways that climate change will affect people's health through exposure to extreme weather, exposure to heat, through hunger and thirst, through the expanding range of insects that carry infectious diseases, and through forms of social disorganization, such as conflict and migration. In June of 2019, over 70 medical and public health organizations declared that climate change is, quote, the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century. Next, topic number 7. What do we know about climate change's likely impacts on nations' economies? This is a huge question, and the answers are far from certain. There are so many ways that climate change can damage a nation's economy. Let's consider just one. The cost of either barricading coastal cities from sea level rise, or the potentially even much greater cost of retreat, relocating whole cities, whole populations further inland. Remember, 11 out of the 25 biggest cities in the United States are either on the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, or near the Gulf of Mexico. Just imagine how much it would cost to barricade those cities, and how much more to relocate 100 million people further inland. Add to that some other obvious costs: the cost of adopting agriculture to changing conditions, the cost of damage done by more frequent and more powerful storms. And that's certainly only a partial list. I'm sure that, with a little more thought, we would have no problem coming up with more big-ticket items to add to it. There have been some attempts to estimate the scale of the potential damage. This study predicts damages to some sectors of the U.S. economy will be in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And this study of global economic costs talks about damage in the range of tens of trillions of dollars. Although it may not be possible to know precisely the full scale of future economic harm, it seems pretty clear that the impacts will be immense, both for the U.S. and for the global economy as a whole. Climate change can undermine the stability, the viability of a society's political system. Failing supplies of food and water, trouble recovering from weather disasters, illnesses spreading. Such conditions can and often do trigger civil discontent, protest, and political crisis. Let's consider here just one possible type of political impact, that caused by increased migration. Today, we are already seeing large flows of migrants from the Middle East and Africa to Europe, from South and Central America north through Mexico to the United States. People migrate when the conditions of everyday life become unbearable, when people can't make a living, when they fear for their lives. Climate change is predicted to worsen living conditions in all sorts of ways, thus triggering even larger migrations, in the range of tens, possibly hundreds of millions of people. Mass outmigration is a clear sign that the society being left behind is already broken. Here are some photos of migrants streaming out of Syria, fleeing the government's violent suppression of popular protest. Migration also has political consequences for the countries where the migrants hope to settle. All throughout Europe, recent in-migration has fueled the rise of right-wing, nationalist, racist political parties. Here is an anti-immigrant street demonstration in Paris, and here a similar demonstration in Austria. Here is an anti-immigrant vigilante ship on patrol looking to intercept migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean. Anti-immigrant street protesters increasingly look like, sound like fascists. Mass migration is only one of several ways climate change can have powerful impacts on a nation's political system. Imagine, in addition, the disruptive effects of food shortages, a shrinking economy, rising ethnic, religious, or other forms of civil conflict, and so on. Many of the world's governments today are either incompetent or corrupt, sometimes both. Realistically, one can have little confidence that they will be able to respond effectively when conditions worsen. It's far more likely that they will fail, setting off levels of disillusionment and levels of discontent that can only further destabilize a nation's political system. The next several topics, numbers 9, 10, and 11, all have to do with unequal impacts at various scales. Some parts of the world will fare far worse than others. We have already seen this map. It shows that some nations are going to experience much greater food insecurity than others. And we have seen this one too. Some nations will have much greater water scarcity issues than others. Overall, some parts of the world, often the ones that are already the poorest, are more vulnerable than others and are likely to fare worse as the crisis deepens. Now, changing scales, there will be unequal impacts within countries too, reflecting internal differences in geographic vulnerability and also differences between rich and poor. Let's consider here just the United States. First, unequal impacts by geographic location. Some parts of the country will warm far faster than others, and some parts will experience more drought. Economic impacts are predicted to vary from one place to another. These are unequal impacts based on location, based on where one lives. We need to look at unequal impacts from another angle as well. As with so many things in American life, social class, that is, wealth and income, will matter. Race and ethnicity will matter. Research in environmental justice shows that poor people and people of color are already today disproportionately vulnerable when environmental tragedy strikes. Here is the scene at the Superdome in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. Poor communities, who are also disproportionately communities of people of color, will certainly be more vulnerable than wealthier communities when climate change's impacts start to be felt. Sociology has always devoted a lot of attention to the question of inequality. It has had much less to say, especially recently, about social disorganization, crisis, and collapse. But the science tells us that a sociology of climate change has to grapple with that possibility. So, on to our final impact, topic number 12. Human beings have thrived over the past almost 20,000 years, from the end of the last ice age to until just recently, because we lived in a time of stable, moist, mild climate. During that period, we developed agriculture, we settled, built cities, built complex societies. What happens to all that if global temperatures increase beyond a certain point, which used to be pegged at about 4 degrees centigrade, but is increasingly said to be more like 1.5 degrees? When people say that climate is an existential crisis, they mean that beyond a certain threshold, the world will have changed so radically that we will find ourselves living in conditions that we, as a species, have never experienced. Let's try to think about what that might mean. The Paris Accords, the most recent international climate treaty, set a new goal, keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees. Currently, though, unfortunately, all assessments agree that we are not on track to meet that goal. Furthermore, this recent report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, argues that the target needs to be set at 1.5 degrees, that conditions will worsen rapidly if the increase is allowed to approach 2 degrees. Achieving the goal of 1.5 would require cutting emissions by 40 to 50% by 2030 and achieving near zero emissions by 2050. The same graph shows, however, that emissions are projected to rise, not fall, by 2030. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, agrees, projecting that the use of oil, coal, and natural gas together will continue to rise. So, what's likely to happen if global temperatures do rise more than 2 degrees, as seems likely right now? Consider the scenario described in this paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It argues that the Earth will be forced out of its recent million-year glacial interglacial cycles into a new state, which they call hothouse Earth. The article offers two different but analogous ways to illustrate its argument. On the left, the glacial interglacial cycle that we have been living in. On the right, we head toward hothouse Earth. The consequences? Here's what the authors write. Hothouse Earth is likely to be uncontrollable and dangerous. It poses severe risks for health, economies, political stability, and ultimately to the habitability of the planet for humans. The good news, if there is any good news to be had in this paper, is that there is still time to avert such a future, but not much time. It will take significant, sustained, systemic effort to avoid moving into hothouse Earth, to steer the planet into a third novel state that the authors call stabilized Earth. Well, by now you're probably feeling overwhelmed, having had to listen to such bad news about our future. It might help at this point to pause the video and take a brief break. Okay, let's turn now to the third and final type of inquiry, societal responses. Here is a list of all the different topics we will have to cover. My discussion of impacts was, unavoidably, pretty bleak. This survey of the variety of responses will, I think, end up presenting a more complex picture. Starting with the science, first, the process of discovery. It was not that long ago, a couple of centuries, that people believed in what one might call steady-state Earth. The planet had always been the same continents, same weather, same ecosystems, same plants and animals. Then, over time, scientists discovered facts that supported a fundamentally different story, a story of change. Species evolving, species going extinct, continents moving, tropical Earth, and Ice Age Earth. As the title of this book says, climate change was discovered. And hand in hand with that discovery came the understanding that in our era, climate change is no longer a natural process driven by, say, volcanism or variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. No, it was found that in our era, it was human activity that was driving climate change. Scientists don't just discover, they also communicate their findings to others, fellow scientists certainly, but also to fellow citizens. Communication becomes urgent when what is being found signals real danger, as is the case here. Climate scientists have increasingly come to fear that most people aren't as alarmed as they should be, and that has motivated them to look for new ways to communicate with the general public and with policymakers. Some, like James Hansen, former NASA climate scientist, have even crossed the threshold from communication to frank political activism. Moving on, the next two responses are locked together in conflict: climate activism and climate denial. Is climate change real? Is it being caused by people? Or is it just the Earth doing its thing like it always has? Is it serious? Movement and counter-movement struggle to shape society's perceptions. Sociology has long been interested in social movements. Let's start then with the climate movement. That movement is today complex, multifaceted, increasingly energized and visible. Pretty much all the older, more established American environmental organizations, such as the ones you see here, now say that climate is a top issue for them. And there are newer movement organizations that focus exclusively on climate activism. Of those, the best known are 350.org and the Citizens Climate Lobby. There is the climate justice movement, which focuses its attention on the ways climate change will be impacting the poor and people of color. Climate activism is now being energized by a younger cohort of activists, college students, high school and middle school students. This young woman, Greta Thunberg, has emerged as the international face and voice of this new generation. This new, younger cohort of activists have been forming new organizations. Thunberg's Fridays for Future, the Student Strike for Climate Action, the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion. On the other side of the issue, there's a well-funded, well-organized, highly visible counter-movement that tries to convince the public that climate change is not happening, that the scientists are wrong at best, misleading and lying to us at worst, or that, well, it's happening, but it's not caused by anything people are doing, it's just nature. The climate has always been changing, so there's nothing to be done. Or, doing anything about climate change would hurt the economy. Environmental sociologists have done an outstanding job mapping out how the climate denial movement is organized. One starting point was, unsurprisingly, the fossil fuel industry itself. We now know, for example, that ExxonMobil's own scientists were telling their bosses decades ago that burning fossil fuel would cause climate change. But Exxon kept those findings hidden and started funding climate denial instead. Even larger sums of money came from several trusts: the Koch brothers Foundation and the Mercer's Donors Trust. That money funded the denialist activities of conservative foundations and institutes, and the denialist message then was broadcast to the public via Fox News, talk radio, conservative newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the Republican political establishment. Here is Senator James Inhofe telling fellow senators that snow is still falling in Washington, D.C., proof that climate change isn't happening. There are denialist websites and lots of denialist YouTube videos. Activism versus denial. We will see this conflict again and again throughout the rest of this survey of societal responses. We are seeing this conflict played out in the private sector. Some politically powerful actors in the private sector, the fossil fuel industry, activist conservative billionaires, are still at the epicenter of denialist organizing. But we are also seeing growing concern coming from other, equally powerful and influential segments of the private economy, such as big insurance. Hurricane Sandy did $65 billion of damage when it hit in 2012. A mere 5 years later, Hurricane Harvey caused $125 billion of damage, a new record for a storm. Big insurance is starting to understand that its business model is at risk. How can it make any profits if it has to pay out ever larger sums when insured property is destroyed by more powerful, more frequent storms? The World Economic Forum, popularly known as Davos, where the world's economic and political elites meet annually, issued this report in 2019. The report states that extreme weather and climate change are the two biggest threats to the world's economy. In this letter, big investors with assets of over $32 trillion strongly urge the world's governments to implement the Paris Accords. So, to summarize, some private sector actors are still promoting denial, while others, powerful others, such as big insurance and finance, have started to side with the scientists and climate activists. Let's now turn to looking at a part of society that sociologists call civil society, organizations or institutions that are not in the private economy and not a part of government. We have already discussed that segment of civil society that is most directly involved, environmental organizations and activists. There is one other sector of civil society that has actively engaged with the climate issue. The nation's faith communities, its organized religions. Here again, we see both pro and con. Politically conservative Protestant faith communities, such as the Southern Baptists and evangelicals, are committed to climate denial. On the other side, we find the older so-called mainline Protestant churches, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Episcopal Church. For these churches, protecting the environment, protecting God's creation, is an integral part of their faith. 1 out of every 4 Americans identifies as Catholic. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops created the Catholic Climate Covenant more than a decade ago. And of course, the current Pope, Pope Francis, has written eloquently about caring for our common home. Now, admittedly, there is ample evidence that declarations by a church's governing authorities, supporting some issue or another, does not automatically mean that that issue matters down in the pews. Still, official endorsements by the leaders of several of the nation's biggest faith communities could potentially prove politically important. Next, sociologists have long been interested in how media shapes people's understandings of or opinions about social problems. Media certainly plays a role in shaping the public's perception of climate change. In the age of the internet, the age of websites, YouTube, blogging, and social media, we need to split this discussion in two, looking first at older media, network television, newspapers, then at the situation online. Starting with traditional media, coverage of climate by major networks has varied greatly over the years. Coverage would peak following some major event, an important international conference, the release of the film An Inconvenient Truth. Then, soon after, coverage would fall. Although it is not shown on this slide, coverage has been rising again since 2016, following the international climate talks in Paris. Until recently, coverage in the print media tended to be rather spotty. But as the number and intensity of extreme weather events has grown, especially in 2019, with heat waves across the globe, flooding in the American Midwest, some big cities said to be on the verge of running out of water, newspapers are increasingly devoting space to climate stories. The sheer amount of airtime or column inches devoted to climate news may not be the best indicator. News can be accurate, or it can be misleading. But research shows that how much the media covers an issue is directly related to how much the public cares. So, the amount of coverage does matter. Turning now to new media, websites, YouTube videos, and so on. As with so many hot-button political issues these days, The Internet's role in climate information versus disinformation is a thoroughly mixed bag. Websites such as Climate Central, Inside Climate News, Desmog Blog, and many others offer viewers sound information on the most recent climate science. YouTube has many excellent science videos. Here's one starring the scientist Katharine Hayhoe. YouTube has more playful climate videos too. Here's Bill Nye, the science guy, setting a toy globe on fire. And here's Little Dickie's pro-climate love letter to the Earth, a video that has been viewed over 150 million times. But, on the other hand, there's tons of denialist content online. Leading denialists have their own websites, such as these. One can easily find many pseudoscientific videos on YouTube, done with good production values. To the unwary, they can look and sound legitimate. On the far fringes of the Internet, denialism can quickly descend toward conspiracy theory. So, it's complicated. The Internet can serve to deepen the public's understanding of and concern about climate change, but it also provides the electronic infrastructure for sowing doubt and disinformation. Now, what about that general diffuse societal reaction that we call public opinion? A look at some Gallup polls tells us 2/3 of the public now agrees that global warming is caused by human action. Less than half say they worry a great deal about it, or say that they believe that it'll pose a serious threat to them in their lifetime. But agreement with those statements has been trending upwards. Drilling deeper into the demographics, we can see that those aggregate numbers hide significant differences. Women are more concerned than men. Young Americans are more concerned than older Americans. People of color are more concerned than non-Hispanic whites. The greatest gap is between Democrats and Republicans. 77% of Democrats are concerned believers, as compared to only 16% of Republicans. Such numbers reveal that the American public is deeply divided. Government policy is the most formal, most official kind of societal response. Let's consider climate policy at several levels, ranging from the global to the local. Representatives of the world's governments meet annually at gatherings called the Conference of Parties, or COP, to forge international agreements. The Kyoto Protocol was the first significant agreement, reached in 1997. Although Kyoto got a tremendous amount of attention, the agreement only called for voluntary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Its effectiveness was then further undermined when the United States refused to ratify it. The most recent high-profile Conference of Parties took place in Paris in 2015. Participating nations agreed to lower their emissions to the point that global temperature rise would be held to, quote, well below 2 degrees. At the end, the world's leaders celebrated this historic agreement. But soon thereafter, newly elected President Donald Trump declared that the United States would withdraw from the Paris agreements. Other nations, however, are honoring the commitments they made in Paris. Meeting in June 2019, the G20, the 20 nations with the largest economies in the world, all, except for the United States, affirmed their commitment to the goals of the Paris Accords. In the United States, there has been little meaningful progress at the federal level. Toward the end of his second term, President Barack Obama was taking some significant steps, setting higher auto fuel efficiency standards, setting stricter limits on emissions from coal-fired power plants, praising the Paris agreements. But years before he became president, Donald Trump was tweeting that he believed that climate change was a Chinese hoax. And once in office, he filled his cabinet, including top officials at the Department of Interior, at EPA, at NOAA, at NASA, with climate deniers. And he moved systematically to undo every climate-related policy initiated by the previous administration. As of 2019, climate politics in the United States is deeply polarized. Republican voters, Republican elected officials committed to denial, Democrats increasingly vocal about the need to act. In contrast, we are seeing significant forward movement at the level of states, counties, and cities. In the cities, quote, across the U.S., over 90 cities have adopted 100% clean energy goals. Those 90 include some of the biggest, most important cities in the United States. At the level of state government, quote, the United States Climate Alliance is a bipartisan coalition of governors committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions consistent with the goals of the Paris agreements. To date, 23 states have joined this alliance, and several states are formally committed to achieving 100% clean energy. And here's one more way society is responding. Technological innovation that develops ever cheaper ways to generate clean, renewable energy, new thinking about how cities should be built or rebuilt. Technological advances are making it ever cheaper to generate electricity from wind and from solar. And, as a result, wind energy and solar energy are both experiencing dramatic growth spurts. And here is one more promising development. Visionary thinkers are designing cities that consume less energy, away from sprawl, away from an urban geography built around the private automobile. Finally, to our 25th and last topic, geoengineering. Concern that the world isn't acting fast enough has led to calls to consider various technological interventions that could be tried as a last resort to forestall runaway climate impacts. This is a response that has not yet happened, but it is being talked about more and more by policymakers and by scientists. The more societies delay meaningfully addressing the climate threat, the more societies may be willing to gamble on some form of geoengineering, even if that means accepting the possibility of unforeseen, unintended, potentially quite dangerous consequences. Ideas for such interventions range from relatively benign ones, such as planting many trees, to capturing CO2 and burying it, to seeding the atmosphere with aerosols that would reflect solar energy back into space, to launching a fleet of giant mirrors into orbit. My discussion of the second kind of inquiry, the one into impacts, was, to be honest, quite discouraging. As I end this third inquiry, I would like to emphasize what I found positive, even hopeful, in my review of societal responses. So here's my list. First, the work of scientists. Then, the continuing rise of climate activism. The role played by powerful private sector actors who are speaking out. Activism in important faith communities. Increasing coverage in traditional media. Positive trends in public opinion. Other nations implementing international agreements. Developments and progress in policy in the states and the cities, and innovations in clean energy and green technology. That concludes my survey of the 25 different topics that make up the sociology of climate change. You can find more information on any of these topics on this page of the website. I think it might be a bit weird to say, I hope you enjoyed this video. Its message was certainly not made to be enjoyed. But I do hope that you come away with the feeling that it is worthwhile to think about climate change from a sociological point of view. Thanks for watching.